baby at home 2 years before that. And Janine was my cellmate at the time. And I just had him, thanks to the teaching of John Africa, giving me the understanding to know that I could do it.
And you were with Mike
in
for
1975.
Get up, stand up. Stand up for your right.
Oh, I got to bring my mic up. And we are live.
Don't give up the fight.
All right. Jamming out with a little Bob Marley there. That's our theme song, we've decided. Yes, on Wednesday nights. Every other Wednesday night. You are listening to WRWK 93.9 FM. And if it's every other Wednesday night, we're coming to you with another edition of HER, Human Equal Rights, with a focus on her, where we talk about women in various situations of inequality, women that are facing abuse, women that are facing just different situations they have to work through, and things that are not right, not equal, where equality is the problem. So tonight, I'm going to let our host tell you all about our topic. It's a continuation of something we started talking about a few weeks ago. I am Sarah Louise, your producer, and I am off camera. I'm waving. Hi! So we're coming to you licensed to Midlothian here at the WRWK FM and serving the greater Richmond, Virginia area, but also beyond with the power of the internet. We are going to be sharing some other information with you about our station, but right now I do want to announce to our listeners and watchers in the Richmond area to remind you that we have this wonderful thing called Stuff the Bus. So for children in our area that are in need of school supplies, you can help support the South State Bank's Stuff the Bus project and help hundreds of children in the Richmond, Virginia community. The bus will be traveling around at different locations. Today is the 8th of August, so we have missed the Midlothian location. That was this past Saturday. But coming up on August 11th, from 10 to 1 each of these days at each of these locations. 10 to 1, August 11th, Forest Hill, Walmart. At August 18th at the Brook Road, Walmart. And August 25th at the Ashland, Walmart. And so all of those locations, and 10 to 1 each of those days, 10 in the morning to 1 p.m., for 3 hours, you can help stuff the bus with school supplies. So I'm going to turn it over now to our fearless and amazing, lovely hostess with the mostest, Leslie Rubio. And you have a website that you created, which is called 1 in 5.
I do.
And can you tell us a little tiny bit about that project before you get into tonight's topic? Because that's that is an amazing thing that you've done, and it relates to this show and why you do this.
So if you want to check the website, it is 1 in 5, that'smystory.org, and it's the number 1, IN, the number 5, that'smystory.org, where you can share your story anonymously about anything that's happened to you with regards to sexual assault, domestic abuse, violence, rape, harassment, anything like that, which is going to help you heal and help others to heal because you've been brave to share your story. So it might encourage someone else to share their story.
Yep.
So you can go check that out if you want to. It's a great site for sharing, for reading other people's stories, and for healing.
Just another outlet, for women, because there are so many women that have these stories, and as we've seen with the Me Too movement, that don't speak up, don't speak out, don't share, and so many times tell themselves, oh, I can't tell anybody about this, I can't say anything, it's my fault. Just all of those typical things that we see on the news, that we hear in people's stories when they do tell someone, and it's this internal victimizing that we do to ourselves. And I have a feeling we're going to hear more of that tonight. with this topic,
Yes.
with this show.
So tonight's topic is human trafficking again, but we're going to be focusing on the trauma aspect of that. We are WRWK 93.9 FM, and we are an all-volunteer radio station. On Facebook, you can look us up at the Work FM. We are a community radio station focusing on community-inspired personal and political conversations. We invite you to tune in to all of our local programs on Monday nights from 7 to 9 p.m. in the Frequency of Hope with Stephanie, Richmond Business Babes on Thursdays, and this show, Her, every other Wednesday from 7 to 8 p.m. In addition, WRWK has an ongoing packages to support the station for as little as $5 a month, on up to as much as you want to donate. We can use your help. As I said, it's all volunteer, and everything we do here does cost money. We have cable bills, we have rent, we have electricity, all your normal bills, and we can use help with that. So if you would like to donate, we certainly would love for you to do that. You can go to our website to do that, or you can go to the Facebook page. There's a donate button on there as well. So on our last show, my guest was Randy Taggart with Impact Virginia. She shared a wealth of information about human trafficking with us. We learned that Richmond is a major hub and 15th in the country in the human trafficking business. We learned who the victims and survivors are, who is targeted, some of the signs to look for when someone is being trafficked, the demand aspect of human trafficking, as well as some helpful information about how we can become personally involved in helping to end human trafficking. We also discuss the different forms of human trafficking, bonded labor, domestic servitude, sex trafficking, and forced marriage. But what we did not discuss is the trauma aspect of human trafficking. And tonight, that is going to be our focus. Our special guest tonight is Elizabeth Corey. Elizabeth is an author and a speaker, a trainer, a coach, a mom, and a survivor of family-controlled child sex trafficking and sexual abuse. She has powerfully transformed her own life and then turned around to help others move beyond the scars of childhood trauma. Elizabeth works one-on-one with survivors through email guidance to establish a personal roadmap to address trauma, triggers, and effects that they have on your daily life. She provides guidance on parenting as a survivor, and she holds workshops on this same subject. She also has a survivor forum on her site that provides training and workshops, and her site is beatingtrauma.com. Again, that's beatingtrauma.com. I also want to provide the number to the National Human Trafficking Hotline. We provided that on our last show, but let's provide it again. That number is 1-888-373-7888. As well, there is a free text line with the Be Free movement, which is 233-733. Where you can text if you've seen human trafficking, if you're being trafficked, if you need help, and they will respond back to you. So as an advocate, Elizabeth Corey has 4 goals. She educates about the holistic impacts of complex trauma and dissociation through her blog and book. Her message focuses on the need for deep inner parts work and practicing awareness on a daily basis. She provides coaching through one-on-one programs with trauma clients, virtual groups to build awareness, and email workshops. She works with survivors who are struggling to overcome the trauma, intrusions, and parents with complex trauma who are trying to break the cycle. She also trains therapists and other recovery helpers on the holistic impact of complex trauma. She focuses on the importance of self-awareness and the use of trauma as a source of connection instead of separation. She also raises awareness of familial abuse and trafficking through legislative advocacy, news interviews, conference presentations, and published writings. She has been featured on PBS, the Huffington Post, and Site Central. So I am very excited to have her on tonight to talk to us about her own story. And I want to ask her some questions that might help our listeners to understand better about the trauma that is a result of not just human trafficking, but sexual abuse. So complex trauma is actually a form of PTSD. And it is characterized as a psychological disorder that occurs as a result of repetitive, prolonged trauma involving sustained abuse or abandonment by a caregiver or other interpersonal relationships with an uneven power dynamic. Complex trauma describes both children's exposure to multiple traumatic events, often of an invasive interpersonal nature, and the wide-ranging long-term effects of this exposure. These events are severe and pervasive, such as abuse or profound neglect. They usually occur early in life and can disrupt many aspects of a child's development and the formation of a sense of self. Since these events occur with a caregiver, they interfere with the child's ability to form a secure attachment. Many aspects of a child's healthy physical and mental development rely on this primary source of safety and stability. So you can see how something like this happening to you not only affects you right when it's happening, but really for the rest of your life, unless you're able to get help for that. And Elizabeth Corey, who I've not met in person, but I have looked at her website, I have emailed back and forth with her, and she is an amazing woman who has been able to overcome a childhood of sexual abuse and family-controlled trafficking, and is now reaching out to help other people. I'm going to be asking her to tell her story, which she has given me permission to do when she comes on to the show. And then we're going to be asking her questions to explain trauma to us and exactly what that does. As well, if you are interested in finding out more about Elizabeth and her work, again, her website is beatingtrauma.com. You can go look it up right now while we're talking on the air if you want to just look into what she's doing, or go later to see her work and what she does. In addition, I think we talked a lot last week about, or the week before, about human trafficking, and we really got a clear view of this is not how it's presented to us in Hollywood. TV, movies, Hollywood.
I have to say that our the discussion that you had with the guest last show,
Randy,
I mean, it blew my mind when she was talking about, because I watch a lot of Law and Order, the SVU shows, and of course the Taken movies. And when you hear the term human trafficking, it does make you think immediately, oh, that's in other countries. Oh, maybe, New York or Los Angeles. Then to hear that Richmond, Virginia is 15th in the country, and why, the reasons why. Then that high schools in Chesterfield County, there are rings
Hanover,
and rings of trafficking students at high schools where my kids have gone to events, have gone to dances, and it's just, I went home and I actually had conversations with my kids, and I was like, let's discuss this, because it's not an easy topic
It's not. And
to talk about, but I mean, you have to talk about it.
If this show brings that awareness
Exactly.
for you to go talk to your kids
Exactly.
and other people
Yeah.
to talk to their kids,
Absolutely.
then we're doing something good here.
Right. Absolutely.
So, you know, that's a wonderful thing to get more information.
I couldn't believe it.
I couldn't believe it either.
Yeah.
Again,
and the
our
way that
idea,
these people work their way into those teenage mindsets, and how easy of a target. I mean, they are, because they think they know everything. So,
and if you weren't listening to that show,
please go watch. It's on our Facebook page.
But what we found out is these people enter high schools and pretend to be friends with unsuspecting kids, and next thing you know, they're all of a sudden caught up in human trafficking, and they didn't even know that they were going to be a part of that. They tempt people with gifts, presents, money, things to get them involved in the human trafficking. They invite them to parties where they might be drugged, and they take photos of them in compromised positions, or even compromised positions, I'll just say, and then from there they threaten the person, because now they're in the hook, and they threaten the person to expose that information if they don't go along with the human trafficking and being sold, basically. So, you know, what Impact Virginia is trying to do is bring awareness, but educate people about it as well. They are wanting to stop demand. So if we end demand, then there's no reason for human trafficking. So that's their focus. But I want to go ahead and welcome our guest, Elizabeth Corey, to the program. And thank you for joining us, Elizabeth. Can you hear me all right?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, great. I have introduced you and to our listeners and viewers. I appreciate you coming on. I have let them know about your website, the work that you do, and I am very thankful to you that you were willing to come onto the show tonight.
Well, thank you so much for having me on the show. I really appreciate it.
Great. So we talked the week before last about human trafficking, but we didn't focus on the trauma aspect of it. So that's what we've let everyone know that's what we're doing tonight. And I let them know that you have your own personal story, and that you are now an advocate, and you I have let them know all of the work that you do to help people who have had this repetitive, prolonged trauma in their life. So if you could, I'd like to start with, if you could share some of what happened to you personally.
Yes, so I come at all of my advocacy work that I do from a perspective of lived experience. So I personally have experienced what is often referred to in the industry as family-controlled trafficking. And this is different from pimp-controlled trafficking in a way that's probably pretty easily understood, that the type of trafficking I experienced was mainly at the hands of my family members. And in my case, it was mostly my father. And it's important to understand with family-controlled trafficking that it is almost never just trafficking. Not that trafficking isn't enough, but there are plenty of other things that are going on within the family, like sexual abuse and physical abuse, and emotional, and sort of this cognitive manipulation and programming that goes on in families that operate in this way. So it isn't as straightforward as being trafficking without all of these other components the part of the picture. And I like to stress that because sometimes we look at trafficking in a little bit of a silo, where we say, well, trafficking is one thing, sex abuse is another, domestic violence is another. But in reality, a lot of times, especially when trafficking is happening in the family, we can't really differentiate between all of these different components of interpersonal violence that are happening in one household.
And I appreciate you saying that, because I think, a lot of people have a distorted view of trafficking, and don't see the relation with all of what you just mentioned, because of what we see in the movies, what we see on TV, the Hollywood approach to human trafficking. A lot of times people see it as happening in another country, where someone's kidnapped, and a lot of drama. But what you're saying is the majority of it is actually happening within families.
Yes, I don't know if it's a majority of trafficking that's happening within families, but I can tell you that it is highly, highly underrepresented within the media and certainly within the statistics, because a lot of people who go through experiences of family-controlled trafficking never really get rescued or get counted as being a victim of trafficking. They're very often really get to a place where they have to dissociate most of what's happening to them away. So they aren't really living with the conscious memory even of it as they are experiencing it in many instances. And so, and this is certainly the case for me, many family-controlled trafficking survivors that I work with in my work, they were never rescued. People will say, well, how did you get away from it? It's like, well, I graduated high school and I left my family, like any kid would. So it's really hard to capture the numbers on people that have been through this type of trauma, were never rescued, and really, in many cases, don't even remember the intensity of what happened to them.
And so, if you could try to or explain to our listeners sort of what family human trafficking looks like, because I think that's probably hard for a lot of people to understand.
Right, yes. Well, a lot of times human trafficking by family members, we're talking about, in my case, it was immediate family members, people who lived in the same house with me. The grooming process, because I'm sure you discussed last week this concept of a pimp grooming someone. I know you talked about it earlier in this show. The grooming process for a family-controlled trafficking victim starts pretty soon after they're born, with abuses, whether that's physical abuse, sexual abuse, really horrific experiences within the family. So this trauma begins so soon after they really arrive on this planet that there's really no time for these children experiencing this to understand that the world even operates in another way. They move into this sort of survival mode almost immediately because of the things that are happening to them. In my personal case, my father was very physically abusive. I had many sexually abusive people in my family who were sexually abusing me from a very, very young age. And when I say very young, I mean 2 to 3 years old. And then eventually, after having been groomed in these abusive ways for so long, trafficking is just the next aspect of the picture within this kind of family environment. And I know that sounds like I'm minimizing it, and I'm really not, but the grooming process is so extensive and starts at such a young age that it really just becomes another step in the process of what the child in these types of families is actually experiencing.
So I understand that part. And all of it is traumatic from the very beginning. The part that I'm trying to understand, and possibly our viewers as well, once this has started, and let's say I don't know what age, when we think about the human trafficking part of it, how does a family member or non-family member, but in your case, family member, go about? I'm going to call it selling, selling a child, a person, into this. I mean, you know.
Right. Yeah. No, I understand what you're asking. Absolutely. And well, there's a few different methods that were used within my family, and I was trafficked many years ago now. I'm not going to give away my age, but I mean, it's been a while since I experienced this. So, of course, the methods have changed pretty dramatically since I was a child. Now we have the internet. The internet did not exist when I was trafficked. I was trafficked at 8 years old. There was no internet. So the approaches that were used when I was a child were very much more sort of interpersonal social experiences. They would have parties where they would trade their daughters with each other. I was sort of rented out to a brothel that was very close to Quantico Marine Corps base, so there was a constant run of clients, if you want to call them that, right? I mean, we refer to them as Johns, of course. I was sold to bachelor parties. I experienced many different approaches. I mean, my grandfather used to take me to bars, and I would sit in the car, and he would go into the bar and send men out to me. So, I mean, we think of trafficking in this way that the media describes it, which is very pimp-controlled, very internet-based, or people are walking the streets. And in reality, there's a lot of very stealth approaches to trafficking that are highly word of mouth, especially in rural communities. And I was trafficked in a rural community, but also in a suburban community. So I think it's important that we sort of open our eyes to all of these very subtle forms of human trafficking that a lot of times are happening right under our noses and within middle-class suburbs, which is what I grew up in, or rural communities as well. That's not what we're talking about in the media. We're just not talking about this.
I agree. And I think when people think about human trafficking, as I said earlier, they're thinking about this happens in other countries where, poor countries where women are just sold, to someone, and they're brought over to the United States and they're trafficked from, a specific place like a brothel, like you mentioned, sort of like a prostitution, from a prostitution aspect of it. When in fact, what you're telling me is this is the Hollywood version. This isn't reality a lot of times.
Right. It certainly was never my reality. I mean, the closest I came to this particular type of trafficking was when I was sort of rented out to this brothel by my father. I did experience sort of that aspect of trafficking. But for the most part, it was through these sort of word of mouth, social situations where my parents were just engaged with others who were like them, and they all know each other. They figure out who they are. It's not that hard for them. And they, at one point I was actually trafficked under the guise of a babysitting co-op where kids are being passed around from house to house, and it was made to look like there was some kind of child care going on. So anything goes for these guys. They can get really creative with their approaches, and that's why it's so important for us to have our eyes open about it.
So when we're hearing your story and what you experienced from a family aspect of human trafficking, are there signs that people can look for say, friends or schoolmates or people who might not know what to look for and know that this is going on? Are there signs that we can look for?
Well, and this is where my discussion on trauma becomes really important, because honestly, one of the signs that we typically look for in people who are being trafficked is going to be more focused on a pimp-controlled version of trafficking. Like most of the education-type materials and awareness materials out there are focused on, here's how to see if a girl is being groomed by a pimp. That's like the most standard stereotypical thing that we see. But when somebody is experiencing trafficking as a part of their living environment, this is what I refer to as just a situation that is ripe for developing complex trauma, which is what you were discussing earlier, which is that PTSD. And dissociation becomes the most significant sort of coping mechanism that somebody in this kind of an environment is going to develop. So we really have to begin to educate ourselves about what dissociation looks like, so that we can see that a particular child is undergoing a significant amount of trauma and stress in their environment at home. And that's really what sort of my work around trauma is trying to do, is get the word out there about what does dissociation look like, what is complex trauma, and how can we not only see it in others, especially when we're looking at it in children, but also how can we see it in ourselves, because a lot of people have experienced trauma and have dissociation on some level and aren't even really aware, because we just become so bogged down in just trying to survive that we're not even really looking under the covers at what's going on in our own world.
So I want you to talk to us about trauma. What is trauma? What's that look like? What can you give our viewers and listeners some information about that?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that I really like to say about the concept of trauma is that, this is another one of those things which, when we get to the media has a tendency to show trauma in a certain way, and we think of trauma as this massive event that has shifted the planet on its axis. And honestly, a lot of traumatic experiences for children don't even necessarily look like that. Now, of course, when you hear my story, you think, well, yeah, that sounds traumatic. But I think in general, we have to open our eyes that traumatic events, one of the biggest things we do is we kind of talk about trauma as a descriptor of an event, when in reality, trauma is actually how we respond to the event. And a lot of times it's something that has happened that we are incapable of processing as a child. We can't figure it out. Our brain cannot wrap itself around what's happened to us. And therefore, we have to develop coping mechanisms and survival skills, because we just can't understand, we can't comprehend what is going on in our world. This can be something dramatic, and it can also be things that are not as dramatic that an adult might see as a bad day, but to a child overwhelms their system. So one of the important things I like to talk about when it comes to trauma, first off, is that it doesn't have to be these severely dramatic events like what I experienced, or earthquakes and things. It can be a lot less intense than that and still have an impact on the child. That's why I like to say that trauma runs on a continuum, just like dissociation does. We're all sort of living with something that we need to address from childhood. Doesn't mean it's something huge, but there's probably something there. When we start talking about complex trauma, that is when we have experienced trauma and stress that are, I use two descriptors: prolonged, which means it's been going on a pretty long time, and inescapable, which means we don't have a way out of it. Okay? And that is really what makes something complex trauma, as opposed to a particular sort of trauma response to a particular event, which is more acute. And that is actually what PTSD is sort of based in, as opposed to CPTSD. And it is when we experience trauma in a prolonged and inescapable way that we begin to develop these long-term approaches to the world, where we are in survival mode, where we have developed survival skills, coping mechanisms, and that is when we kick into some pretty heavy levels of dissociation. And dissociation is what I work with mostly in my work with my clients. We are trying to find out how we have employed this amazing coping mechanism during our childhood, but we're trying to discover how is that now affecting us as adults in ways that aren't healthy. So this is the work that I do with my clients, because dissociation is an amazing coping mechanism, but if we use it for our entire lives, it can become really debilitating. We can really struggle to be adults and living a healthy life with heavy dissociation.
Sure. So, in thinking about that, so, there's probably, like you said, most of us probably have had some type of trauma or something that we have buried, I guess. I think in reading on your website, I noticed that what you said was pretty much forget about all this stuff. You've erased it from your memory, and it isn't until a trigger happens that brings it back, but you're not even really sure, what's happening.
Exactly. That is, I would say that is the number one most common response to complex trauma, is to forget what's happening, or forget pieces and parts, for sure. Some people forget everything, like I did. Some people forget some of it, but not everything. And some people remember everything, but they have repressed all the emotions associated with it, and so they sort of tell the story as if they're completely numb. They're like, yeah, this horrible thing happened to me, but there's no emotion associated with it, right? So these are different ways that we use dissociation to survive these horrible things that are occurring. And it has a major impact. I mean, it gets us through childhood. It really works.
Sure.
It's brilliant. I often say, let's not just, trash this thing as just a bad thing, because yes, it's driving us crazy in adulthood, but it kept us alive in childhood. And that's important to understand, that it is a brilliant mechanism for staying alive in horrific situations. But when we get to adulthood, it's very problematic. And it is problematic in childhood, too. I don't want to say that it's not. A lot of kids are being diagnosed with things right now. Like, for example, we've seen a huge uptick in the diagnosis of ADHD, okay, anxiety and depression. There's a lot more sort of mental health diagnoses that's going around with children these days. And what is getting missed is the fact, well, it has been missed, although people are starting to catch on now, but what has been missed is that a lot of these kids are actually suffering from trauma, and that the ADHD symptoms, the focus issues, the anxiety, the depression, the stomach problems, all of these things are actually coming from their traumatic experiences, as opposed to some kind of sort of what we often refer to as like a chemical or biological imbalance that has just caused this. There's actually a reason why it's happening. And we have to start paying attention to that.
So I know you do that in your work, in your forums and seminars, bringing awareness to this, so that people can understand it better, because we don't know enough about it. Again, we're presented with a Hollywood version of trauma, of human trafficking, and that's what most people see it as. They really don't understand it. So I'm hoping with you being here tonight, we can get a better understanding of that. So when you're talking about trauma, what causes complex trauma, and is it common?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because I do think that almost any experiences in the home in particular that are prolonged and inescapable. So if you were living in an abusive home, you are almost guaranteed to experience complex trauma as a result of living in an abusive home in general. So that's probably the most common form of it, although I do have clients who also experienced complex trauma through sort of medical trauma when they had significant medical problems as a child, and maybe they were going through their experiences in a hospital that was not trauma informed, especially if it was a while ago, 30 years ago, something like that. I also have clients who've experienced refugee trauma, and all of these things have created the symptoms of complex trauma through dissociation. But it really is that prolonged and inescapable experience of trauma and stress that can create it. So that's what's going to bring it on. And then the level of dissociation will sort of follow suit. If the complex trauma is severe, the dissociation has more of a possibility of being severe. When we experience sort of small traumas throughout our lives, we may have little or less expressions of dissociation. But I think all of us dissociate on some level. I like to tell people, have you ever walked in a room and you don't remember why you went in there? Or did you accidentally stick your keys in the refrigerator? Or, you're driving to work and it's a 20-minute drive and you have no idea what happened for that 20 minutes and suddenly you're at work. These are all dissociation on some level. So we're all living with it on some level. But what we're talking about here with complex trauma is where people have learned how to go away for a significant period of time. They're gone. When I say that, I mean they are just not in their body. They have sort of left the room. They're operating from some sort of shell of their being, and they may respond to you in a way that has been developed to respond to traumatic situations. So.
Okay. So we have someone that's called in who has a question for you. So if you could hold on 1 second, we have Tanya on the line, and we're going to let her ask her question. So if you could, hopefully you'll be able to hear her, and then if you could answer.
Great.
Okay, Tanya, go ahead.
Hi, this is Tanya. I have two questions, actually. First of all, I think it was interesting that you mentioned that your father and your grandfather were part of this process. Is this something that is like family organized? Is it like a family business? How far did this situation in your particular family go back? Is this generational? Is it still ongoing? And then the second question was about the trauma. What kind of coping mechanisms are used to help the victims of this type of childhood trauma? I'll hang up so I can hear the answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanya. I really appreciate it. I can definitely address both of those. Right. I will say that when families traffic, it is almost always a result of generational trafficking. I think it's almost inevitable that when you have a family that is trafficking, that it has been happening for a long, long time. I know that was absolutely the case in my family. I do like to say that, parents don't just wake up one day and go, I think I'll traffic my children. Generally speaking, there has to be a pattern, and more than likely parents who are trafficking have themselves been trafficked or have been involved in sort of the trafficking experience even when they were children. And I think it's actually very rare when that isn't the case. Like, I think that's very, very common. So that's the answer to the first question. The second question is, this one really does get back to this idea of sort of how dissociation works within our systems. And as I was mentioning earlier, this idea that we sort of go away, right? That we leave the present situation and we leave our bodies. And you hear about this with war veterans who have been in POW camps, things of that nature, where they just like leave. They forget, they're not present. They're gone from what's happening to them in that moment. This is exactly what children do. And actually, they've actually done some studies that have shown that the brain of a child in an abusive household is actually responding to life in a very similar way to a war veteran. So we know that they're having these kind of things happen. The coping mechanisms associated with dissociation there are countless coping mechanisms that can be used. Some of the biggest ones will be, for example, you might, especially in children, I'm trying to focus on children here because the question originally was, how do we see these kids? But daydreaming, for example, just sort of leaving the body, leaving the present situation and going to this mode of just staring out the window and daydreaming during school, not able to focus, not able to pay attention because you really just can't be in the moment because the moments have been so scary. Really just not having any sort of energy in the body, just not being present, not being grounded, which is a term that gets used a lot. Also emotional numbing, so just not being able to really feel anything because you can't sort of deal with the emotions of what's happening to you, so you just numb all of your emotions. But that can also sort of play out as emotional explosiveness. So you might have a child who is numb most of the time, maybe even when they hurt themselves, but then one little thing will happen, like they'll drop something and just totally lose their mind and explode, and they can't calm themselves back down. This is sort of when they're not able to hold everything back anymore. You might see a response like this. Many of the coping mechanisms for children when it comes to complex trauma, unfortunately, look like behavioral problems. And so what happens is the child is experiencing this trauma at home, and then on top of that, they're experiencing punishment in school environments and other types of environments for behavioral problems. They're being punished for coping with the trauma, which is horrible. But this is sort of where we are in our understanding of how to deal with complex trauma. We're not where we need to be awareness-wise so that we can begin to help these kids who are dissociating. It's a huge issue. So that's a long answer.
Thank you. And someone on our Facebook page was thankful that you pointed out the difference between PTSD and CPTSD. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
How do we heal? How do people heal from this? What can they do? If these things are buried and what you said is it impacts you later in your adulthood, how can we recognize these buried things and what can we do to heal from it?
Yes. So, one of the best things that we can do as adults, if anybody's listening to me tonight and they're like, oh, I may be a little bit more dissociative than I think I am, or, I've sort of experienced some things that maybe I haven't faced, or I believe I've experienced some things that I haven't faced. One of the absolute best things that we can begin to do is examine how we can build awareness of what's happening within our own, like, sort of mind and body. One of the things I work with a lot with my clients is mindfulness and awareness of just beginning to examine how are we responding to our daily lives. How is our mind sort of running the show for us? Because a lot of times with heavy dissociation, we live in the mind, and the mind runs everything for us. The mind tells us everything to do. And honestly, our best decisions don't even come from the mind. They come from our intuition, but we can't reach that when we're not in our body. So one of the biggest things we can begin to do for ourselves is really working with building mindfulness and awareness of the mind and the body. I do this. This is one of the things I do with my clients. Also, I highly recommend talk therapy as one option, but I also do suggest that people begin to do something that is body work related. And I mean, that can be any number of things, from yoga to Reiki to massage. It really depends on the individual. A lot of people who have had complex trauma really like EMDR, which is another form of body work. Those are all really powerful ways for us to begin to get in touch with what we may be ignoring within the body. And the body is one of the most telltale signs that we have sort of unresolved trauma in our system, because when we start to have sort of chronic physical ailments, which was something I was dealing with at a very young age, those can be a sign that there's something in our systems that we have to deal with. It's like the body is saying to us, wake up. It's time for you to address this stuff. And so, we can use that as another sign. It's less obvious in children because they're still so young. They're able to sort of cope with the physical aspects of dissociation. But in adults, it really starts to take a toll on us. I mean, I was in my mid-20s, and I, would get up in the morning and my feet would hit the floor, and my entire body was just like aching. It felt like I had arthritis everywhere. And that is sort of a sign that I had this unaddressed trauma within my system. So I also highly recommend writing and journaling. It is the number one approach I use with my clients. It is very effective, especially when we use emotional journaling, where we are actually journaling from our emotions. The healing involved in that just cannot be understated. So those are some approaches. I could seriously go on for 3 hours about how you work with this and heal it, but that gives you some idea there.
Okay, and when you talk about emotional journaling, what exactly does that mean?
Well, a lot of times when we're journaling, let's say that we're feeling anger, for example. I love to use anger as an example. We're feeling angry, and we go to journal, and a lot of people will say in their journal, I am angry. I'm angry at this person. I'm angry because this happened. Okay, that's how they sort of write about the anger. Okay, I like to refer to this as there's about the anger and there's from the anger. Okay, from the anger is when we ground into our body as much as we can, and we write all the curse words. Okay, I mean, we don't hold back. We really let this person have it, even if we know from the bottom of our hearts that this person doesn't deserve it. That doesn't matter, because we're just writing. And that's all we need to focus on. Just write it, then you can turn the page and never look back at it again. But it is so important, because a lot of times when we're having an emotional reaction to something in the moment, that emotional reaction, especially when it's sort of a little bit intense for what has actually happened, is actually based in something that's very different. Not very different, but something maybe similar, but that happened a very long time ago, often 30 or 40 years ago. And this incident, whatever it is that's made us angry, is triggering that old thing, whatever that old thing is. And if we write from the emotion, if we really let ourselves feel it, we can often open a gateway to understanding where the anger actually started and where it's really coming from. And that's a huge part of the process that I do with my clients.
Thank you for explaining that. And thank you for letting our listeners know about some of the different ways that they can heal from this very damaging trauma to their lives. I want to ask another question of you. So I think you said that you sort of discovered this in your 20s or something happened, a trigger so that made you aware that there were these suppressed memories. Did you know what to do with that? How did you know to seek help? And what about people who don't have those resources, who can't afford to seek help, or what can they do?
Yeah, great questions. I actually didn't discover my memories until my 30s. My 20s were spent largely trying to avoid all of this. I was highly, highly anxious and very physically sick, like chronically ill a lot. But I didn't get my first memories back until I was in my 30s, and it was because I gave birth to two little triggers, simultaneously, as I like to say. Those were my twins. And you know, they just, as soon as they were born, they started triggering my own personal experiences that I wasn't paying attention to, and I became very anxious. I had no idea what was wrong with me. I really didn't. I just knew all of a sudden I really didn't like my family, and I really didn't know what to do with my kids. And I had to figure something out. So I did start going to talk therapy. That was my first step. And it did take a few years before I began to really uncover the repressed memories that were happening under the surface. You know, and you asked such an important question about what to do if you don't have the resources, because this is a serious issue within the mental health community. You have to be privileged and you have to have money in order to get the services you need to heal. And we all know that a lot of times when you've had severe trauma, you don't have that. You know, as a life coach, I do charge for my services, but I will also say that one of the things I do is I offer blogs as well as live streams every single week for free that you just have to sign up for and go to my Facebook page, and you know, you can get information from me weekly that doesn't cost a thing. I do also have a program that's only $35 a month, which does give people an opportunity to work through some of their stuff. I offer worksheets and all sorts of things. It's called Survivor's Guide for Life. If people need, you know, help with healing their trauma, and they have zero resources, you know, some of the best things that they can do is try to find mental health resources that are either covered by insurance in some way, and there are plenty that are. Unfortunately, I'm not one of them, or through hospitals and things that have programs specifically geared. But unfortunately, in the United States, we don't have a lot of free healthcare options. We don't live, unfortunately, in a country that offers that. I work with people in other countries who do have more resources than we do here in the U.S.
Thank you so much for talking about that. And again, I want to bring your website to the attention of our listeners, which is beatingtrauma.com. Again, Elizabeth Corey, who has shared her story and helped us understand better complex trauma, what it does, the ways that we can do things about it. And then again, her website, beatingtrauma.com, is going to have a host of resources for people who may not be able to afford some mental health care. She said that she has information on her blog, and you can also sign up for a weekly seminar that she provides for free. So I want to thank you again so much, Elizabeth, for being on the show. Thank you for sharing with our listeners. We really appreciate it. And thanks for being a guest tonight on WRWK.
Thank you so much, Leslie.
Have a good evening.
You too.
Thank you again to our listeners for joining us tonight on the Work FM, on Facebook, and on the radio 93.9 WRWK. I hope you learned a little bit tonight about the trauma aspect of human trafficking, and you might understand better what complex trauma is, which is C, PTSD. Again, if you want more information and some free help, please visit Elizabeth Corey's website, which is beatingtrauma.com. Again, I want to mention that we are always in need of help at the station financially to pay our bills. If you at all you can provide any kind of help, small or large, go to our website, go to our Facebook page, The Work FM, and hit the donate button. We welcome you to be an ongoing supporter through packages that we have, or a one-time supporter if you can do that. So thank you so much. Turn it back over to Sarah.
Another great show. As always, you're always so prepared, and what great guests. So yes, I've been posting all this information for folks to check out these websites and to be better informed citizens. We're going to take it out with a little bit of Bob, and a reminder to join us at 11 o'clock tomorrow morning, the 9th, for another edition of Richmond Business Babes. It will be all about glass making, which will be really exciting. So join us for that. And thank you for tuning in. We are WRWK, and we'll go back to our regular scheduled programming. Thanks a lot, and good night.
Get up, stand up for your right. Get up.